So earlier we talked about the phenomenon that there's now a new generation of private healthcare and clinic owners and operators who are very young, ambitious, tech savvy, and also craving for innovation and operation effectiveness, right? They're very commercial minded. Can you tell me, what do these characteristics and behavior look like in detail based on your own experience?
Yeah, I'm going to steer clear of clinic names just for now, but happy to give some examples. So I think you've got this sort of transition happening in healthcare right now, where you have very capable healthcare leaders who would have trained in a certain clinical discipline. So maybe they trained as a physio, maybe they trained as a dentist, they trained as a dermatologist, and they would have graduated from med school, and they would have probably gone off and worked in someone else's practice. So in a larger organization or even a small practice as an associate physio, an associate dentist. And I think what's really interesting is that they get there and they come to realize that there is a lot of inefficiency in the practice. They don't necessarily agree with the brand and the customer service delivery model for that clinic. And so they start thinking, hold on a minute, I can do this better, or I can do this differently, or I wouldn't do it that way, or why don't we also do that? And I think they probably get this, almost like this bug, to bring their own care-based approach into the world, thinking that there is a better fit, more modern fit between how they envision giving care to patients and how maybe the older guard or the legacy generation has. And I think in industry, you might call this like the rise of the entrepreneur doctor. And you see a lot of that today. So you see practitioners who would have worked in another clinic for, say, 4 or 5 years after med school, and then they'll just go off and start on their own. And I think those practitioners, they have a commercial motivation and a clinical motivation. And I think there's some emotional tension in there. I don't think that people often talk about profitability in healthcare. They will talk about clinical care, they'll focus on clinical care, but profitability is this sort of taboo. We shouldn't talk about the money. We've got some practitioners that we work with who will not take payment from their patients. They say, I don't want to be involved in the money. I'm not interested. Meanwhile, that patient walks out the door and they don't pay you for 4 weeks. So now you're having to cover your staff's salary, even though that patient hasn't paid you because life got busy. So there's this sort of tension between commercial and clinical. And I think that this sort of new wave of practitioner, and you see it a lot in dentistry, you see it a lot in medical aesthetics and dermatology, in chiropractic, physio, MSK. I think you're seeing people start to come to terms with the fact that we're a business and we're a practice. And how do we sort of get those two things to work together? And there's a lot of dialogue around, I signed up to be a doctor, I didn't sign up to run a business, and now I'm finding myself have to cover an enormous content space that I didn't previously understand, didn't have any exposure to. When I worked as an associate practitioner, I basically sat in my treatment room all day and I saw my patients. I didn't really understand the inner workings of the business. And so you get a lot of practitioners who are moving out on their own, opening practices. They usually start with 1 or 2 treatment rooms. Usually they are the brand. And some of them start to realize, like, hey, we've got a winning recipe here. I'm in the right location. I found my patient demographic. They're finding me. Referral is working really nicely. It's not the case for everyone, but I think for that practitioner, the sights are set in a sort of different place. And I think what's also really interesting is that that practitioner is usually thinking about their journey as one that is sort of defined by clinical success and delivering really high quality experiences for their patients, but they are also thinking about liquidity at some point. They're thinking about a business outcome, a financial outcome for themselves and for the practice. And I think that's new. It's new in a lot of places, and it's definitely new in the UK because you've had this public healthcare provision, which is starting to fray and unbundle at the edges, especially in some of the elective and self-care place. So you can sort of see that dynamic playing out with large private equity acquisitions coming in, buying out smaller practices. Those are financial outcomes. Like, they're also clinical outcomes. You want to deliver high quality clinical care, but those are financial outcomes. And I think this new wave, this new generation of practitioner is thinking about that, rightly so. I mean, they're doing the hard yards for years and years and years. It's not easy to run a practice. So they're rightly motivated by clinical outcomes, but also by commercial outcomes. And I think that's an exciting thing to see. It's what's moving the sector forward. I think part of it is around mindset shift. So I think what you're starting to see is the intersection of healthcare and hospitality. These two things are converging. So healthcare is about the clinical outcome. Hospitality is about the experience that you have as a customer. And I think in this entrepreneur healthcare environment, people realize that the clinical outcome is not enough. The commercial outcome matters, the customer experience, the hospitality matters too. And I think what we will see in the next generation is that starting to drip out into other parts of the healthcare ecosystem. And that's an exciting thing, because a huge part of healthcare and efficiency is around the experience out of the clinical environment, or outside of the clinic room, outside of the treatment room. And so the fact that you have this sort of early adopter community, a community of practitioners who came from the old guard, who are now thinking about the new guard, who are thinking about efficiency, who are thinking about customer experience, it's a completely different way of envisioning a healthcare experience. And you can see this all over the spectrum, from radical technology adopters or even technology builders. So great example is a company like Neko Health, which is venture capital backed. They do a lot of med tech, but when you walk into a Neko Health clinic, you feel like you're stepping into the future, which is the opposite experience you have when you step into many healthcare practices today. So that's two very different ends of the spectrum, and not everything will be Neko Health, and that's okay. But what you will have is a cohort of practices that are starting to think about design, that are starting to think about brand, and that's really exciting. And you can see that. I always say Google reviews are the best way to see that. I mean, Google reviews is not a thing you would expect of healthcare. It's a thing you'd expect of restaurants, of holiday destinations, of service providers. But clinics who are thinking about customer activity and customer engagement are thinking about things like Google reviews. And you can see the imagery on some of the websites for these clinics. They're advertising it like it's a hotel experience. They're taking beautiful pictures of the inside of the facility. They're putting up testimonials and quotes. They're doing customer interviews. These are service-based businesses, and they're high-value service-based businesses. So I think the wider sector sort of looking at these entrepreneur doctors and saying, hold on a minute, what's going on in here? What are you guys doing that's different? Why are people choosing to lay out meaningful money for this experience as opposed to the old experience? And what can we learn from that? So I think that's an exciting sort of crossing the chasm moment that otherwise wouldn't really be happening in the space.
So it really comes down to the quality of experience being delivered, as in terms of the shift from the older generation to the, like you said, the old guard and the new guard. The new way of doing things is really focused way more on quality of the patient experience, right?
I think so. I mean, there's two. So I'll give you two very different patient experiences, right? So the first one is you go to a dermatologist, and maybe you have a mole that you need to have checked, right? So you'll go and you make a booking, and one version of that is you call the practice. You say, I'd like to come in to see Dr. So-and-so. And the person answers the phone on the first engagement. You don't wait. They book you in, you get instant confirmation, and you get a really strong nurture sequence leading into that first visit. And maybe even you have a touch point in advance of that visit saying, hey, here's what to expect. Hey, here's what to look forward to. If you have any questions, let us know. Here's all the intake. And then you arrive on the first day. Someone offers you a drink when you sit down. You are in the waiting room for no more than 4 or 5 minutes. The clinical practitioner who's overseeing your case knows exactly who's coming into the room. They come in, they're full of energy and excitement, and they're ready to deliver this experience for you. That is one version of reality. Down the road, you have a completely different version of reality. You call the practice, nobody answers. It takes 48 hours for them to get back to you. You send an email in with a question. Nobody responds. You get an automatic responder that says, our office hours are from 9:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. And like, good luck if you can catch us in those hours. You get an invoice by post, by email, and by SMS. All of them are asking you for the same thing. None of them give you an opportunity to actually make payment for that invoice. So then you're stuck having to go in and enter those details into a bank account and try to complete that transaction manually. So you have this almost impossible juxtaposition. And I think the question that a lot of people in the sector should be asking themselves, they're not necessarily asking themselves right now, is where do we want to set the standard? Like, what is an acceptable form of healthcare? Because oftentimes you look at veterinary, which is a privately motivated industry, and the quality of care for your dog is often better than the quality of care for your child. And like, that is a huge problem. Like, fundamentally, that's a huge problem. If healthcare is a societal right, how could it possibly be that I can take my pet gecko in, but I can't take my son or daughter in because the front office experience is so disjointed that it just takes that much longer. So you've got this real sort of pros and cons, this contradiction in the space right now, which I think is natural for where the industry is.
Yeah, totally. You briefly touched on your own experience as a clinic owner. Can you tell me your stories as a clinic operator from the very beginning? How did you get into operating a clinic, and how did you? And what are some of the key challenges and opportunities you were going to bring into the industry based on your own experience?
Yeah, so I think my path into clinic leadership was a bit different. So I start in medical device development. So I hadn't worked in healthcare previously. I don't come from a family of doctors. A lot of people who work in healthcare, my parents are doctors, my grandparents were doctors. I had this healthcare incident when I was younger, and they have that deep connection. And I just didn't have that. That wasn't my experience. So I started working in hardware, specifically in laser technology for use of skincare treatment. And we ended up taking that medical hardware and using it in a clinic environment. And so I was working with an organization that built the medical hardware, and then I helped to oversee its use in the clinic and ultimately led that clinic to be successful. And I think pros and cons, right? So because I didn't have that deep patient intimacy and understanding, I was doing a lot of things for the first time. In a way that I think practitioners who come up through a clinical pathway, they just understand patients in a way that I certainly never did. And so I was always envious of people who just had that bedside manner and that understanding of what makes patients feel this way and that way, and how to manage expectations around the treatment journey. These are things that I was learning for the first time. So definitely some growth areas. The benefits were that there was no playbook. There was no rule book. There was no way to do things. So we had the opportunity, and a lot of the team that I was working with came from outside the sector, and so we could rethink how things have always been done, the common sense ways of doing things, which actually make no sense at all. And so we had that opportunity. And I think one of the things that jumped off the page to us very early on was around that front office experience. How do patients get served when they're not physically in front of you? Because when they are physically in front of you, happy days. Healthcare practices, much like we were able to deliver a great experience for them when they were standing in front of us, easy. The people in the clinic are almost intrinsically motivated to deliver that service. It's a big part of why they went into healthcare in the first place. When they walk out the door, totally different animal. And I think there's a lot of white space in the sector to allow practices to deliver that experience that they're really proud of delivering, but just delivering it outside the clinic. And it's actually, for us, we found like the source of all evil is what happens when the practitioner and the patient are separated. It's not what happens when they're together. When practitioner and patient are in the same room, everyone's happy. They're well looked after. Practitioner is motivated and aligned. That's what they signed up to do. But when they're not together, you have poor clinical compliance, people not following up with their aftercare, people not following up on behalf of the clinic. So you have this gradual breakdown. And that's often why healthcare issues go unresolved. And it's often why patients disengage from practices. So I think for the practices that really figure that out, and you can call it loyalty, you can call it retention, you can call it engagement, you can call it communication, you can insert any word you want, but ultimately it's about building this vibrant relationship with the patient when they're not physically there. And that's a really, really hard thing to do as a small practice team, because if you've got 5, 6, 7, 8 treatment rooms, you've got a staff of 25 people, how many relationships can you maintain? There is a ceiling. There's a ceiling. You keep getting new patients. Legacy patients start disengaging. You have a finite limit. And again, people will say, oh, well, we just throw AI at it. This is AI phone system, AI answering service. Great. So like now people don't have to wait when they call in. But what happens when they haven't shown up for 3 months? What happens when that conversation that happened in the clinic that helps the clinic team understand, oh, this person has a personal circumstance, or, oh, this person's away for a bit. Are they going to document that in a structured manner such that that magical AI agent can interpret that information and make the right decision in 3-4 months' time? Question mark. I don't know. Who knows? It could be the case. But I think what we found in the clinic environment was figuring out how to extend that experience was the difference between very meaningful revenue uplift, profitability, cash flow for the clinic that gave people a sense of purpose, that allowed practitioners to see patients through their clinical journey. When that wasn't in place, and it wasn't in the early days. In the early days, it was just make sure we're delivering the right experience when people are in front of you. But when you can start to extend that quality of care, remote monitoring, but almost remote customer service, remote customer success, you end up finding that actually that body of patients that you've delivered a great outcome for, that's where your growth comes from. And I love giving the example of hip replacement. People often think, oh, hip replacement, it's one and done. But it's not really one and done. First of all, people have two hips. So it's never really one and done. The second reason is that hip replacement is a great example of a patient who gets to a certain point in their life, who has to go through hip replacement, and most of their peers are also going through hip replacement. And what are people talking about on a Sunday lunch when they're at the pub? They're talking about hip replacement. Oh, I just had my hip done. How was that experience for you? It was amazing. You wouldn't believe it, Dr. So-and-so. They did the most amazing thing. The team was exceptional. And then suddenly you have a whole new community of customers who are coming from that conversation. People don't talk about their experience in healthcare that way. People don't talk about how amazing it was to go somewhere. They talk about the ridiculousness of having to wait. So if you can deliver that experience to your hip replacement, to your IVF, to your dermatological exam, whatever the experience is, that person will go home. They will talk to their friends. They will talk to their family members. They will celebrate and champion your service. Then suddenly you don't have an issue of acquisition and Google ads and Facebook ads and website all those problems start to go away. And suddenly you're focusing on delivering a really high quality service for a narrow group of people who help to build your practice with you. And you see this a lot in pediatrics because you have this very continuous journey, but you don't always see it elsewhere. We've got one practitioner, I won't give his name. He communicates, not sure this is the right way to do it, but he communicates with every single one of his families, if they so choose, on WhatsApp, one-to-one. Now, granted, no scale in that. You can't serve a large number of patients in that way. But the experience and the quality of care and the quality of connection between the practitioner and the patient, I mean, you'd think he's their uncle, right? And you should be able to replicate that experience at a larger scale. And that is not currently happening in the sector right now.
With technology.
Absolutely, with technology. Needs to be technology empowered, absolutely.
Yeah. I'll remove myself if it doesn't create what do you envision? Well, maybe the better question is how do you envision that AI would disrupt or enable a better patient experience to be delivered in this industry?
Yeah, I think you have to put that against the timeline. So AI over what timeline, right? Because even a year ago and today, the answer is probably very different. And so I think if we just focus on today, let's not imagine what the future holds just yet, but if you just focus on today, I think the real unlock will happen in two places. The first one is very well understood, deeply embedded workflows. So things that are documented, known, and done on repeat. Phenomenal use case, a great way to create leverage, a great way to create capacity and to offload some of that administrative burden. One of the problems with respect to patient engagement is that you don't have that repeatability. You do have that repeatability if someone's calling in for a scheduling issue, or I need to rebook, or can you validate my insurance, or something administrative. But you don't necessarily have that consistency around the service level. And so I think one place for impact is around administration and offloading. I think the other place is enabling the human. And a lot of people say, oh, the human in the loop, right? What is a human in the loop solution? It's a human that is dedicated to monitoring and understanding and interacting with AI, but not as a fractional, I'm also doing these 5 other things, right? And so a lot of solutions that I think are AI first are sort of sold to the clinic like a software product. Hey, we're gonna put AI on you. We're gonna give you AI. So, okay, cool. Who in the clinic is going to be responsible for when things don't work? Who in the clinic is going to be accountable for when AI doesn't interpret correctly? I'm not talking about passing it over to a human. I'm talking about actively focusing on the AI impact, the delivery model, the quality of outcome. If that's not someone's job, you're going to end up with this disconnect. And we already hear stories. We've actually have a clinic that we work with who has tried to implement AI first front office solutions and it works 80% of the time, 75% of the time. And hey, if that's good enough, then maybe that's okay. But in healthcare, it's not, right? It's different than returning shoes online. If it works 80% of the time, how bad can it get? Not that bad. Like one unhappy person, you give them new shoes, they're good with it. It's okay. All is forgiven. In healthcare, it doesn't really work that way. A, you have clinical emergencies that need to be escalated in the right way. And B, you've got all kinds of complexity. A simple example, a parent paying for a child. Well, unless that's managed correctly, you can't reach out to the child. You're not allowed to re-engage the child directly if they're a minor. So you have to go to the parent. How is that handled? And is that documented very clearly across the practice management software, EMR, EHR? The answer is no. Oftentimes, you don't have that quality of documentation. Most practices don't know what's going on in their own practice management software because they're overwhelmed. So suddenly you throw agent in there and you're setting a match to something that could explode. And I think that's why you need to have the other opportunity for impact really being a combination of a human and AI or augmented human solution, which gives clinics the ability to almost interact with something that feels like a service, but underneath the hood scales like software. That's a hard thing to build. That's a really, really hard thing to build.
It's similar, I guess, because of how complex and critical the healthcare industry dynamic is. It's similar to like plumbing, right? You can't use software or robotics. I mean, plumber, everybody's saying plumbing is like the last thing.
The safest job, yeah, exactly.
I guess it's similar with healthcare because it's so more mission critical, so much more complex than an office white collar job. I guess that's kind of the same. I guess healthcare is the last thing being actually fully automated or AI-fied.
I don't know, right? I mean, time will tell. But I think one of the things you have to believe is that there's going to be a risk tolerance, a window for risk tolerance. And how small does that window have to get before the human starts to fade away? And I think it's absolutely incredible that you have 99% clinical accuracy in some of the models today. I think it's amazing that you have calls being handled at scale. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening, especially in the US, where you have high volume healthcare being managed or augmented largely by technology, by AI agents that are doing voice handling and SMS. And that's incredible. But we are so early in this thing. We haven't yet seen the full cycle. The full cycle is when the wrong data goes to the wrong place and some hallucination causes some issue and then suddenly someone's getting sued. Then the question is who? Like, where does that go and how is that handled? What happens if there is a misdiagnosis? What happens if it's not properly understood? What happens if that extra care doesn't, come into the patient's journey? So I think we're at a stage right now where the best outcome is one where it's not on the clinical pathway. So if you're dealing with things that are administrative, that are business, how bad can it get? Not as bad. Pissed off customer, not necessarily poorly treated or poorly diagnosed. So non-clinical pathway, happy space, I think, for the time being. And I think the other thing that you have to consider is where are you going to empower the clinic to make a new step? Because more tech bloat, more software, more buttons. Software's been around for a very long time. Healthcare has been a late adopting industry, and you have to sort of ask yourself why. And why is this suddenly the moment for people to start aggressively procuring software solutions? And you have to believe that the ROI is there. And I just don't think we've seen that yet. I don't know that we've seen that in a reliable enough way. I think one of the places that you've seen impact really start to happen is in, as an example, AI augmentation for call centers. Great. Like if that call center is healthcare specific, but you're enabling the call center to use AI, fantastic. It's healthcare focused, but you're really enabling the call center. The operational workflows are call center workflows, which you also have call centers for sneaker returns and you have call centers for booking agencies. So you have an operational workflow, not a high contact patient workflow. And I think there's still a lot of learning to do there.
Do you believe that's where the biggest impact will be made in the next couple of months' time? Where by improving and boosting the efficiency and effectiveness of that operational, like for specific section of the operational workflow, it would improve the overall profitability, commercial aspect of clinics, private clinics.
I think, early on we talked about the the new entrepreneur doctor and the commercial mindset that comes with that agenda. And I think it's really interesting because oftentimes the decision makers in healthcare practices are doctors. And because they are doctors, because they're medically inclined, they want solutions that are going to make their life easier. Medical scribes are like it's the best example of that, right? I don't want to write up my medical notes at the bottom, at the end of the month. What comes out the other side? And I think the reality is that if you're thinking about enabling clinical work, there's no shortage of solutions. And I think that space will be very, very invested in, very, very supported. I think if you're thinking of the business of a clinic, there is a huge opportunity to serve that part of the organization. And you can look at that in a very small practice. So where is the business of a clinic happening? It's happening at revenue and it's happening at cost. So how are you acquiring and converting new patients who are reaching out to you with interest? How are you retaining them? And then what does your cost footprint look like? What are you paying for? How are you paying? Can you pay less? Is there a way to optimize that spend? Those are not clinical functions. Those are business functions in a healthcare context. And I think that is, as a former clinic leader, I think the most exciting place of growth for me is looking at the P&L of the clinic, looking at the profitability of the clinic, almost taking I know it's sort of not loved by the sector, but taking a private equity first view of a clinic and saying, here is an opportunity to create margin. And hey, actually, we create that margin. We reinvest that into great clinical care. We reinvest that into better patient experience. It's very hard to reinvest 20 minutes of savings from a medical scribe into patient care. Maybe the practitioner's less burned out. Maybe they get to the next appointment, they're a bit happier, they're a bit more excited. I buy that. But when you're thinking about hiring an extra person, or you're thinking about creating a new virtual front door, or you're thinking about rebuilding your booking flow and intake capabilities, you need money to do that. Like, that money has to come from somewhere. No one's handing that out. So I think the opportunity space that is really exciting in healthcare is how do we transform the business of that clinic, allow the clinical work to continue as is, make it better, make it faster, but where do we create margin growth? Where do we create revenue uplift, cost compression to really drive that clinic forward?
Earlier this week, you shared with me a front office assessment template, right? So which is a scorecard template that we share with clinics to use to self-assess how effective and efficient their operations is, right? Can you briefly talk about what it is? What is it for? Why is it critical for any private clinics in the UK to run through this once per month or maybe even more frequent?
Yeah, so if you look at a private healthcare practice, one of the things that keeps everyone up at night is Care Quality Commission, who are regulating the clinical activities. Are we ready for audit? This is one of the things that keep people up at night, and rightly so. Like, you need clinical standards in a healthcare environment. And the helpful thing or unhelpful thing is that you have long checklists and protocols and standard operating procedures. How do I wipe down the floor? How do I wipe down the handle? When do I wash my hands? There is incredible regulation and specificity in the clinical components of healthcare. And then there is nothing when you think of the business. There is almost nothing, right? So we have healthcare practitioners. We work with a practice. We've had this conversation with them many times over. Hey, like, what does conversion look like right now? That's it. That's the end of the conversation. There's no answer. There's no knowledge. There's no understanding of how should we even be benchmarking conversion? What do I even measure? We've got another practice that they have a lead capture form on the website. They get an email in an area of interest, but no phone number. So now you have a channel that's dead. You cannot re-engage that lead. How do you even know to look for that? Right? You figure it out. A lot of practices figure it out. But when you're starting out, when you're thinking about growing that practice, you see it at the edges. Another really good example is, what is my response time when I get a lead incoming inquiry? Is it less than 5 minutes? Because we know that lead conversion drops off a cliff after 5 minutes. So you're doing all this work to generate marketing activity. Every healthcare practice I know, it's like this indoctrination in the sector of SEO. Long live the Google, right? It is an SEO thing. And every practice is obsessed. Are my pages SEO optimized? Are my pages SEO optimized? Is this page SEO optimized? And then someone comes in the front door, knocks on it and says, hey, what do you guys do? am I the right person for you? It takes 24 hours to get back to them. So you've done all this work. You've paid an agency. The agency has told you all the wonderful things about SEO optimization, but no one is converting that lead. Or even worse, you're expecting an administrator to convert that lead. You're saying, here, administrator, people are asking about our services. Can you please convince them to come here? Not sell to them. Healthcare is not a sales-first business. Healthcare is a discovery-first business. What is the problem you're trying to solve? Can we help you solve that problem? Right? In a similar way that if someone reaches out to a dermatology practice and asks about their teeth, sorry, we don't do that here. Try down the block. But if someone reaches out about a skin concern, you need to work with that patient to discover and engage and support them through that transition. And so when we think about a scorecard for your front office, we're trying to get practice managers and practice leaders to have a reliable way to look at their front office operations and say, I'm a 4 here, I'm a 5 here, I'm a 3 here, I'm a 1 here, I'm a 1 here, I'm a 1 here. Hold on a minute. This whole category I'm not strong in. And that whole category might be intake. And by intake, I don't mean the forms. Right? Everyone has intake forms. Most of them are garbage, but put that aside. Intake forms being one thing. But what is the journey? What is the reminder cadence? How do I compress my DNAs? I think one of the things that's really interesting, if you look at intake, a lot of practices will send you automated communication when you make a booking. Your appointment is next Saturday at 4 p.m. Then they'll remind you on Thursday. Your appointment is on Saturday at 4 p.m. But nobody is asking the patient to take an action. Nobody's asking the patient to confirm, to type Y. Sometimes you see that in a restaurant, sometimes you see that in a hair salon, but in healthcare practices, you rarely get that escalation of commitment. So when we look at front office operations, we're saying, how many of your new leads are being nurtured through to a successful first appointment? That's one area of assessment, and it doesn't take 5 hours to do that, right? You can go in, we call it 10 and 10. Spend 10 minutes every 10 days. 10 minutes every 10 days, go in and look at a specific area of the practice in the front office. Are we managing recall? How are we doing that, right? If I'm just sending emails out, cool, that's a 1 out of 5. Am I coupling emails with WhatsApp and phone call? Maybe I'm at a 2 out of 5. Am I doing that at a time that is optimal for the patient, not optimal for the practice? Maybe that's a 3 out of 5. Do I have a built-in system where if my recall person drops off or goes on holiday or goes on parental leave or they don't work out and I have to replace them, is that whole function going to die? Or does someone else know how to keep it going? Cool, now I'm at a 4 out of 5. And am I tracking revenue uplift? Great. Now I've got a full process and I'm at a 5 out of 5. But there's no way for healthcare practices to know what they're doing right now. So they're sort of staring into the abyss and saying, what's normal? Am I doing a good job? Am I doing a bad job? No idea. So we're trying to bring a sense of standards to what it means to be a commercial practice, not at the cost of being a clinical practice, but in the interest of better serving patients.
So if a clinic could only fix one thing, of course, that's oversimplifying the situation, right? But what is, in your opinion, what is the biggest, and in your experience and opinion, what is the biggest one thing for any clinic this quarter to move revenue fastest? What would you pick? And what does good look like in practice for this thing?
Patient recall.
Say more.
That is the only thing. If you can only fix one thing in clinic right now and you want to move revenue, patient recall. It is the single highest impact, best pound for pound spend and investment that you can make in your clinic. And I would not do anything else. This quarter, if I had to pick one initiative in clinic, it would be patient recall. It would be the only thing that I would focus on. Number one, you're leaving value on the table if you're not. Number two, what we find over and over again in practices is that they are indexed to a solution that doesn't work. We already do that. We hear this all the time. We already do that. We send out emails. We send out an email 3 months after. We send out an email 6 months after. We send out an email 9 months after. And if we don't hear back from them, we don't think that it's relevant anymore. And we know for a fact that is wrong. A, we know emails don't work. B, we know that it takes sometimes 4 touch points, 5 touch points, 6 touch points to re-engage a patient. And C, we know that patients that do come back to life, who are regenerated, who are re-engaged, often re-engage not just in a single appointment, but in multiple appointments. So you have to think about the time value that you're getting back on that patient recall activity. Let's say you reach out to a patient and it takes you 2 weeks and 5 touch points to check in and bring them back into the clinic to continue their journey with you. And then when they're in clinic, they make a decision to come back not next month, but the month after, or maybe they decide to do a treatment course for 3-4 months, or maybe they realize my cousin needed this thing as well. A single touch point or a series of 3-4 touch points has the potential to generate 3,000-4,000 pounds of revenue upside for your practice. There is nothing you can do in almost any business where you see 4,000 pounds off of a series of WhatsApp and phone calls. The economics are extraordinary, and it is not send email automatically on random day at random time with random generic message, not recall. So when we look at recall, we want to see a reliable system that uses multiple channels, that is owned and reported on and measured by someone in the clinic. Is my recall working? Not I'm doing it, but is it working? How much of my revenue is coming back into the practice from that body of patients that used to come in, that came in a while ago? If you can answer those questions reliably, then you're at the beginning of putting in place a patient recall service that actually makes sense and actually works. But rarely, if ever, do we see this as a gold standard in a clinic. So if we had to focus on one thing in any given quarter, it would be patient recall. That would be the only thing I would focus on. You will create 10x the value that you might spend in getting new leads, that you might spend on new marketing initiatives, which are going out into the world in a funnel that's probably not optimized. So we would focus entirely on patient recall.
Interesting. Can you share some? You don't have to obviously share the names of the clinics. Can you share some actual numbers and examples of, for example, what's ROI? What is the kind of revenue impact on, these patients that doing recall with a patient recall with Coherent?
Yeah.
What's before after?
Yeah. So when we work with a clinic, we often start in what we call like the ice bucket. The ice bucket is the community of patients who saw you at some point in the history that nobody remembers. And we start there because nobody is engaged in that patient population. And it's often been months, if not years, since that patient population has heard from you. And that's a shame. And we start there, and we often find that there is a real opportunity to bring some of those patients back to the practice. And so you can think of that as marketing spend, right? You're marketing to a known population rather than an unknown population, and you are seeing direct ROI. You're seeing return on investment on that activity, because unlike marketing, where you have a new patient and you don't know if that patient will be a good fit for the practice, and you don't know if that patient will actually come all the way through your funnel and book an appointment and come back for a next appointment, you're reaching out to a patient population who have already done that. That is very clean revenue. It's not dirty revenue. It's clean revenue. And so we start in that ice bucket, and then we start to get warmer. We get to the at-risk patients, people who are do not shows, who are last-minute cancellations, who keep pushing back appointments. And then we start to try and move from recall to retention, retain those at-risk patients, keep them engaged in the process. And what we see in our practices is that revenue starts coming back in within 2 or 3 weeks of start. And sometimes you're seeing 4x, 5x, 6x return on investment based on cost of service to that practice. You will not see numbers like that in marketing spend initially and at that speed. You just won't. You'll spend on the agency, you'll spend in-house, you'll spend on the ad set, you'll spend on the creative, you'll spend on the copy, you'll spend, and then you'll wait and you'll see what the lead movement is, and you'll see if that lead movement is good, and you'll see if it's high quality intent. And it could take you 3, 4, 5 months to see return on that investment. In your recall population, if you build a system that makes sense, that engages that patient body, you will see ROI in the order of multiples, 5, 6. In one case, we work with a clinic where we saw 12x return on investment, 47,000 pounds of rebooked revenue in the course of 4 months, 47,000 pounds of revenue. That's almost 10% revenue uplift for them each month over the course of that 4-month period. You will not see that impact and that uplift from a new patient population. So it is the most obvious place for you as a clinic to focus on. And I would love to meet the clinic who has a strong recall program in place and can point to it and can say, here, look at the numbers. But more often than not, what we find is the perception of recall, the idea that recall exists, but not the reality. The numbers don't point to recall. The practitioners are not doing the recall. The administrators are not doing the recall. So nobody is doing that work to a high standard. And so there's huge white space. And the opportunity for revenue growth is very meaningful in that patient population.